What would you do if the person you trusted most your entire life turned out to be a stranger? That question has been echoing in my head ever since the morning I discovered my father's journal. I'm 78 years old, and after a lifetime of believing I knew who my father was, I now realize I was living beside a carefully constructed story. The discovery did not happen in some dramatic thunderstorm. It happened quietly, in dust and sunlight, in the attic of my childhood home while I was sorting through boxes that smelled of old paper and forgotten years. I had returned there because age has a way of making you want to put things in order. The house was supposed to hold only memories, but it was guarding secrets. Behind a loose wooden panel in an old trunk, I found a leather-bound notebook cracked at the spine. My father's handwriting carved into the cover like a warning. His name and another name beneath it, one I had never seen before. My hands were shaking before I even opened it, as if some part of me already knew that once I read those pages, the version of my life I carried would never return. At first, the entries looked harmless, dates, places, short remarks, but they didn't match the stories he told us. He had always been the quiet, respectable man, a factory worker, a loving husband, a devoted father. Yet these pages spoke of cities he claimed never to have visited, of meetings held at night, of identities exchanged like coats. They whispered about 1940s train, stations, coded messages, people without real names and decisions that felt heavy even before I understood them. The words, "not who they think I am," appeared again and again, underlined, almost carved into the paper. As I read on, the air felt colder. It was as if my childhood photographs hanging downstairs were lying to me in silence. Every birthday, every family dinner, every lesson he taught me about honesty now had a shadow behind it. I kept turning pages, even when I wanted to close the book, because once you open a secret, it pulls you forward. The journal wasn't just a record, it was a confession written for someone who was never supposed to find it. And somehow, that someone became me. Before I go any further, I need you with me. Stories like this are not just about secrets in my family. They are about the hidden truths inside every family, the things we sense but are afraid to face. If any part of this makes you feel that strange pull in your chest, tell me in the comments what you think happens next, or whether you've ever discovered something that changed how you saw someone you loved. Your perspective matters more than you think. If you're still here, it means you understand how fragile identity can be, how a single journal can turn an entire lifetime upside down. So make sure you like this video and subscribe, not just for numbers, but because the more we talk about stories like this, the more we realize none of us are really alone with our questions. Your interaction helps this story reach others who might need to hear it. I grew up believing my father was the definition of stability. He woke at the same time every morning, polished his shoes until they shone, folded the newspaper with military precision, and spoke little but firmly about right and wrong. Our house looked ordinary from the outside, but inside it ran on his quiet rules: doors locked, curtains closed at dusk, questions kept short. As a child, I mistook discipline for safety. As an adult, I now see discipline can also be a disguise. The journal made that difference impossible to ignore. The careful handwriting was the same hand that taught me to ride a bicycle, the same hand that signed my school papers, yet the voice on those pages belonged to someone who lived parallel lives. He used to tell us charming stories about his youth, about simple factory work, about dancing with my mother in small town halls after the war. But the journal mentioned nights spent away, unexplained trips, different names written next to the same dates, like he was keeping score in two realities at once. I started replaying childhood moments with new lenses, the phone calls he took in the hallway with his back turned, the visitors who never stayed for coffee, the locked metal box he kept in the closet and called old receipts. There was always a reason not to ask more: respect, fear. Or maybe I sensed that if I pulled one thread, the whole fabric of our life would come undone. The first real crack appeared when I reached an entry dated the same day as my 10th birthday. I remembered cake, candles, laughter. He had left early, saying work needed him. In the journal, that same date held coordinates, initials, and a short line: no witnesses, no mistakes. I froze. That line sat beside my childhood happiness like a shadow pressed against sunlight. What was he doing while we sang in the kitchen? How could two truths coexist without touching? Another twist came when I saw my mother's name underlined next to a warning. She suspects. The word suspects changed everything I thought I knew about their marriage, about the silences between them at dinner, about the way her smile sometimes didn't reach her eyes. The man I called father had built a life like a stage set, convincing from the front, hollow if you walked behind it. Neighbors adored him, employers trusted him, and I worshipped him because children do that. It is our first instinct. Now every compliment he ever received feels like part of a script he directed. The journal showed patterns, careful separations of accounts, coded initials, stories prepared in advance in case anyone asked. He wasn't improvising. He had rehearsed the role of good man so long that even memory bent around it, and yet between the lines there were traces of fear. Small notes like "too close" and "move again soon" made our many relocations suddenly make sense. We weren't chasing opportunity. We were outrunning something. I still didn't fully understand. I kept reading because stopping felt like betraying the truth, and continuing felt like betraying the person I thought he was. That tension is its own prison. Each page loosened the floorboards of my past. The holidays, the photographs, the lessons about honesty, coming from a man whose life was stitched from omissions. You think your childhood is solid until you find the hinge it's hanging on. Then you hear it creak, and once you hear it, you can't unhear it. The journal suggested allies I had never met, debts I didn't know existed, and a network of names that appeared and vanished like ghosts. One name was circled 3 times, then crossed out so hard the paper almost tore. That name would soon return in the most unexpected place, tying my family to events no one in our small town would have dared to whisper about. The first pages looked almost innocent, but the more I read, the more they felt like a map of someone else's life wearing my father's. Handwriting as a disguise. Lines were written, then slashed through with sharp strokes, as if he was trying to erase the past, but couldn't quite bring himself to tear it out. There were dates that didn't match our family timeline, and cities he swore he had never visited. Havana, Dallas, Berlin, Buenos Aires. Next to some places he'd drawn small symbols, triangles, arrows, initials, like a private language he assumed only he would ever see. It didn't read like a diary. It read like a logbook from a life that required secrecy to survive. Certain names kept appearing and disappearing, some written carefully, others scratched away until the paper bruised. One of them was the same name I'd seen circled and violently crossed out in later pages. Seeing it here again felt like hearing a knock in a locked room. Then came entries that didn't sound like my father at all. Meeting successful. Package delivered. Witness relocated. He had always mocked spy novels on television, yet his real life sounded more like one than anything we watched together. One page simply read, "No photographs," then beneath it, "Burn after reading." He hadn't burned it. Was that forgetfulness? Or a choice? Then came the coordinates. Not street addresses, numbers and degrees. I copied one out of instinct and checked the old atlas we kept downstairs. It pointed to a place tied to headlines I grew up hearing whispered about at adult tables, events people called accidents, disappearances, tragedies with unresolved circumstances. There it was in my father's handwriting, days before the world learned about it. The realization crept in cold. My life had run parallel to history in ways I never imagined. My father hadn't just watched major events unfold. The journal suggested he might have been standing behind the curtain when they did. There were also softer confessions tucked between the coded lines, sentences that shook me more than the mysterious ones. "I am not who they think I am. If my son ever finds this, forgive me." My name wasn't written, but I felt it there, pressed under the ink. He had written about the boy seeing shadows that weren't there, about my questions he gently redirected, about my mother's eyes that noticed too much. Reading that made the house itself feel complicit, as if the walls had always known and stayed quiet. One page, dated in the late 1950s, mentioned a change of identity completed. followed by a list of documents, the name I knew as my father's placed beside another identity like overlapping masks. It wasn't a typo. It was an exchange. That was the moment I realized the man who raised me may have once been someone else entirely, possibly more than once. I thought of every time he hesitated before saying his own birth date at offices, the way he disliked cameras, the way he avoided reunions. Those weren't quirks, they were precautions. And yet the journal didn't answer as much as it asked. It opened doors and left them, half ajar, pointing toward people I had never met and places I thought belonged only to history books. There was mention of a final deposit, a silent agreement, and something he only called the incident, always capitalized, never explained. The closer I read, the more I felt that some truths had been intentionally buried, not by strangers, but by my own blood, and that unearthing them might change more than just my memories. It might change what my family name actually means. There is a moment when you stop asking, "Who was my father?" and start asking, "Who exactly lived in our house wearing his name?" That shift happened when I reached the section of the journal where he stopped writing like a worker and started writing like an architect of his own existence. He described identities the way a tailor describes suits, measured, altered, worn, then discarded. One name for work, another for travel, another for conversations that could not be traced. It was chilling, not because it sounded like fiction, but because every detail was written without drama, like routine maintenance on a machine he had become. He explained how stories are built. You repeat them until even you believe them. I recognized those stories. They were the ones he told at dinner. The same childhood, the same factory, the same clean and simple past. Now I saw them for what they were, rehearsed narratives designed to close questions before they opened. He wrote about the importance of edges, keeping separate lives from touching, never letting people from one world meet those from another. Suddenly my childhood made sense. The neighbors we never visited, the relatives who existed only as names, the constant advice to avoid attention, to stay small, to be careful with trust. There was a confession buried in the middle of one page. A man becomes what he pretends to be long enough. It explained the calm he carried, the way he could smile and look perfectly ordinary while hiding, entire continents of silence beneath his voice. He referenced sponsors and handlers, words that belong to lives built in shadows, not to the man who taught me to tie my shoes. He described burning photographs, moving often, keeping suitcases half-packed, not out of adventure, but out of necessity. We thought we were restless. He was simply never finished becoming someone else. The most disturbing realization came when I saw how deeply the illusion included us. He wrote about building a family because it offered cover, but then in the next line he admitted something unexpectedly human, and then the cover became my real life. That sentence stopped me. It meant he had loved us, not as props, but as people, even while living behind masks. The contradiction sat heavy on my chest. He could love genuinely and still lie completely. Both things were true at once, and accepting that meant letting go of the simple categories of hero and villain I'd used all my life to feel safe. Then came the name that had been circled, crossed out and returned. Someone he called the Witness, someone tied to an incident that changed the direction of nations. I didn't know whether that was exaggeration or understatement, but I recognized the fear threaded through his careful handwriting. His notes shifted tone, shorter, sharper, as if written in rooms where doors could suddenly open. He spoke of being paid to disappear and rewarded for silence, of truths that must never become public record. The life I knew as steady and predictable was, in reality, balanced on secrets he carried alone. Reading those passages, I felt my identity bend. If my father was constructed, what did that make me? A chapter in someone else's cover story, or the one person he wished would eventually understand. It is unsettling to realize that the story of your family may have been a defense strategy. It is even more unsettling to sense that part of him wanted to be found out at the end, that the journal itself was a final key left in plain sight in case time ever ran out. The further I went into the journal, the more it stopped feeling like family history and started feeling like an unmarked road that regular people are not supposed to walk down. Names of cities appeared next to dates I recognized from newspapers and documentaries, moments the world called accidents, tragedies, unexplained failures. My father never wrote the full event. He didn't have to. Short phrases were enough. The motorcade, the airship, the missing girl, the union man who never came home. Each entry was like a fingerprint left next to history, smudged but undeniable. He used initials instead of names, but the initials were paired with locations anyone my age remembers hearing in hushed tones. That was the first time I felt truly afraid, not for what happened to him, but for what knowing any of this might mean for me. He described meetings in hotel rooms where the curtains stayed shut in the daytime, long drives where he was told not to remember the route, and envelopes passed hand to hand that were never opened in the same place they were received. He didn't claim to be the mastermind of anything. In fact, his words made him sound like one cog in a machine built to make things happen without signatures. But cogs matter. Without them, nothing turns. The journal suggested he had been close enough to the center of certain storms to smell the rain before it fell, and far enough away to disappear before the questions began. That distance was his safety, and ours. Then came a twist that stopped me mid-sentence. He wrote that one of the assignments intersected directly with our family, not metaphorically, but literally. A person we called an old friend of the family was no friend at all, but someone placed near us to watch him, maybe even to protect him, maybe to control him. Childhood memories rearranged themselves instantly. The man who always brought the same gift, who asked too many casual questions, who vanished from our lives without explanation. According to the journal, nothing about his presence was accidental. My upbringing had been guarded in ways I never knew, like living in a house with invisible locks on every door. Another entry mentioned a debt that could never be repaid and a promise that could never be spoken aloud. He referred to the price of silence, and for the first time, I wondered whether his constant vigilance, his rules, his distance, were not just habits, but consequences. It dawned on me that our calm dinners, our quiet neighborhood, our ordinary life might have existed only because he carried something for other people who preferred not to be seen. History had brushed our table without introducing itself. Still, the journal kept its most important connections implied, rather than named, as if he knew that writing the full truth would endanger anyone who read it. He avoided specifics at the exact moments you wanted clarity. Most then drifted back into domestic notes about fixing the fence or buying school shoes for me the next line down. That juxtaposition was the most unsettling part. World-shaking events on one line, groceries on the next. It made me realize history and ordinary life do not live in separate rooms. They sit at the same table and pretend not to know each other. The question crept in slowly at first, then refused to leave. If my father lived two lives, who else helped him hold the mask in place? Secrets don't survive alone. They need caretakers. As I kept reading, I began to recognize faint outlines of other people moving quietly through my childhood, like actors in roles I never realized were scripted. Certain neighbors who always changed the subject when his past came up. A relative who warned me as a child, "Never ask your father too many questions. It makes him uneasy." At the time, it sounded like respect. Now it sounds like instructions. The journal hinted at agreements of silence, people bound not by ink on paper, but by shared fear and mutual vulnerability. My mother appeared between the lines more clearly here than anywhere else. He never wrote, "She knew," but he didn't need to. He described her as the one who sees without demanding answers. I remember the tired way she smiled when he came home late, the pauses before she said his name, the carefully curated normality she protected like a fragile glass. Maybe she wasn't fooled. Maybe she chose our stability over the danger of the truth. Love sometimes disguises itself as silence. Then another realization landed like a weight. Loyalty is complicated. Some people in his orbit stayed close because they cared about him. Others stayed close because they were afraid of what he knew. Old family friends who visited rarely, spoke softly, and watched the windows more than the conversation. They weren't just cautious personalities. They were people who had once stood too near the heat of whatever incident he kept referencing. I began to see my childhood home as a quiet intersection where secrets crossed paths, nodded politely, and kept moving. One passage shook me more than the rest. If anything happens to me, there are those who will say nothing because they love me, and those who will say nothing because they fear me. Both kinds of silence sound the same. Reading that sentence at 78 years old made my hands tremble. It meant the quiet around my father wasn't accidental background noise, it was constructed. Silence was a currency everyone around him had learned to use, including me, without ever realizing what we were buying or selling with it. There were also hints of fracture, someone he called the one who broke ranks. The tone changed when he wrote about this person, less professional, more wounded. Trust, betrayal, reconciliation attempted and abandoned. I wondered if that was why we moved the year I turned 12, leaving friends without goodbyes. Maybe the move wasn't about opportunity. Maybe it was about survival after trust cracked in the wrong place. I started to understand that the web wasn't only spun around him, it was spun around us, and every thread I touched vibrated back into decades I hadn't lived. What unsettles me most is this: secrets don't just belong to the people who keep them. They shape the children who grow up in their shadow. They teach you how loud to speak, what not to ask, where not to look. Only now do I realize how much of my personality was molded by rooms with unspoken rules, by glances exchanged across dinner tables when certain topics appeared. The journal didn't only reveal my father, it revealed me to myself, and that may be the most disorienting truth of all. The last pages felt different the moment I touched them, as if the paper itself understood it was carrying something heavier than the rest. The handwriting grew slower, shakier, like a man writing against time, rather than with it. There were fewer codes, and more sentences written plainly, as if he had finally accepted that the person reading would need clarity, not puzzles. He wrote about the incident without naming it, but this time he added something new. I did what I was asked, and history called it something else. That line settled in my chest like a stone. It meant that the story the world believes and the story that actually happened might be parallel tracks that never officially meet. Then he wrote about me, not by name, but unmistakably. He deserves the truth, but the truth will not leave him untouched. I realized the journal was never meant for strangers. It was meant for the person left behind when his lies finally ran out. He admitted that the identity I knew as my father was a second life built after a first one burned itself down. There were hints of another family, not described in detail, just a sentence that read, "Some lives must be mourned in silence." I had to stop reading there for a long time, because that meant my story was connected to people I will never meet, and loss I never knew I carried. The real shock came in the form of a single paragraph, carefully boxed in by pen lines, as if he wanted to make sure it could not be missed. He confessed that he had once been present not just near history but at its center, standing in a room where a decision was made that changed lives far beyond our own. He didn't describe the decision. He described the weight, the sleepless nights, the quiet dinners after headlines broke, the knowledge that millions believed one version of events while he carried another that had no place to live except inside this book. He wrote, "I chose silence because truth has consequences measured in lives, not in words." Reading that at 78 forced me to face a question I never expected to ask. What do I owe the world, and what do I owe the dead? If I speak, I might disturb stories that hold people together. If I stay silent, I become the next link in a chain of secrecy that has already stretched across decades. He warned that some names, if spoken aloud, start clocks ticking that cannot be stopped. I looked around the empty house while reading that line and understood that even now, even here, the past still breathes. The final sentence wasn't dramatic. It was tender. If you are reading this, it means I trusted you to carry both the love and the truth. That broke me more than any revelation. It meant I was not just the child of his lies. I was the heir of his honesty too, however late it arrived. Now the question is no longer who my father was. The question is who I will be with what I now know. Secrets shape families, but so does the courage or fear of the ones who inherit them. If you stayed with me until the end, thank you. Stories like this are heavy because they remind us that every family carries hidden rooms, sealed doors, and truths that don't always fit the stories we were told as children. If any part of my confession made you reflect on your own past, on the people you thought you understood, then this conversation is already doing what it needed to do. If you're still here, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. There are more voices like mine, more final confessions, more journals, letters, and memories that were never meant to see daylight, and they deserve to be heard. Please leave a like. It helps this story reach others who might be carrying questions they've never spoken aloud. And if you made it this far, tell me in the comments exactly this sentence so I know you were here until the end. I carried the truth with you. Thank you for listening. Now, whenever you see an old photograph, a sealed box, or a forgotten notebook, remember, the past is never as silent as it looks.